Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We've been out of pocket for a full week now, so it's been almost 2 weeks since we've been together here. And as I usually do on Monday, I get a little bit nervous. I'm an extra nervous today because it's been almost 2 weeks. Thank you for tuning in to our Virtual Center program today. It is a pleasure to be with you. I've missed it. We had issues that came up. We didn't have a producer because our producer was otherwise engaged last week with some environmental issues, and we canceled. But it is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. I invite you to participate actively in our program by giving us a call. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. It almost seems like we have to begin at the very beginning because it's been so long since we've been together here at the Virtual Center. Let me share with you a bit of a preview as to what I think today's program will look like, hopefully when it's completed. Actually, this program is shaping up to be one of those a little bit of this and a little bit of that type programs, and part of the reason is because I've received a couple of very, very solid emails from listeners over the course of the last week, and in one case particularly from Betsy in Texas. I had asked her for permission to share the email that she forwarded with me. The link actually was an article here on today's program, so I definitely want to do that. I also have another short piece of information I wanted to share with you as well. And then I wanted to begin or resume our challenge into the Federalist Papers by looking specifically at Garry Wills's book, Explaining America, which focuses on the Federalist Papers. We had begun that, if you remember, but we hadn't gotten too far into it. We talked mainly about the organization of the book, and we talked about the fact that the first portion of the book was a comparison between Madison and Hamilton, utilizing information and text taken directly from the Federalist Papers. And of course, Garry Wills's idea in his book is to suggest that while there are distinct differences between the two men, there are quite a few similarities as well. And in fact, he entitles the first two sections of his book the extent to which Madison was Hamiltonian, and the second one, the extent to which Hamilton was Madisonian. So I think you get, just from those titles, an idea as to where Garry Wills wanted to hope to take us in his book, and we'll be going there as well. Again, I invite you to participate actively in our program. Let me take this opportunity while it occurs to me to repeat once again our phone number. The area code is 304, and the number is 574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. Actually, the first issue that I wanted to address is somewhat of a personal one, but I think there's a message here worth repeating. I can't remember whether I had said anything previously, but for the last couple of weeks, my wife and I have been caring for her 3 grandchildren while their parents went on vacation. They went to Europe, actually, and part of the issue is that that my stepson, my wife's son, is in the Navy, and he will be deployed within the next few months for probably a year. So this was a vacation that they really believed they needed to take. So we had the 3 children with us for about 15 days. I might say, because I think this is important to keep in mind, the ages of the 3 children are 7, 6, and 2. So needless to say, at our age, and I'm kind of lumping my wife's age in there with mine. I'm actually a little bit older than her, but for purposes of this discussion, we're both much too old to be taking care of 3 children that age. That's all I can say. But anyway, we did it, and we survived. And in the process, we had some absolutely wonderful experiences and little things that occurred that will stick in our minds for a long, long time. And that brings me to the story I wanted to share with you, because this one I couldn't resist. When it happened, I made up my mind that I would share this with you the minute we got our program here at the Virtual Center back on the air. I had the 2 oldest ones, the 6 and 7-year-old, in car seats in the back seat of the car last week, and this was on the last day that they were here. It was last Friday. And we had to drive to a local kennel because for 2 weeks we had put their dog in a kennel for the 2-week period that they were here, primarily because we have a dog and 2 cats, and it just wasn't going to work. So we were on the way up the road to the kennel to pick up their dog. And I had music on in the car, music that I listen to, which is actually music from, I like the music from the 60s, 50s and 60s especially. Obviously that's the music I grew up with. And so we were riding up the road, and we were about 3/4 of the way there. And out of the back seat, the 6-year-old makes this little question, asks me a question, totally out of the blue. And this, about the 4th or 5th song was playing in the time we had been in the car. And actually, I remember it was Sonny and Cher, "I Got You, Babe," if you remember that one. And the 6-year-old, Samantha, asked me a question and said, "Does all of your music have love and baby in it?" And I almost ran the car off the road. I thought, my God, what an absolutely wonderful statement. Because as I thought back, most of the songs that she had been listening to for the last 15 minutes or so in the car were songs about love, or, or baby, or "I've Got You, Babe," or something like that. And so she asked me this very serious question. And all I could think of after that is, it really says a lot about today's priorities as opposed to the priorities of the 50s and 60s. And so I tried to explain to her. I said, yeah, because at that time, that was people's emphasis. Most of the music was about love and how important people are to each other and all of that. And maybe we've lost a little bit of that over the course of the years since then. I just thought, out of the mouths of babes, Grandpa, do all of your songs have love and baby in them? Wow. And I thought, hey, I guess they do. And I'm not sure that's all bad. But anyway, I wanted to share that story with you. I thought it was delightful little story. I don't believe I've mentioned this before, but one of my lifelong friends and colleagues, we were in graduate school together in 1965, 1966. So that kind of places us we're about 45 years that we've been close friends. My friend Bob is a dean at the University of Missouri in St. Louis. But when he left graduate school, and he left before I did, He left to teach in Great Britain, and he taught in northern England for 27 years. So we were pretty much separated during that entire period, and we just got back together again when he came back to the States about a dozen years ago. But anyway, Bob has undertaken a project which I think is just delightful. And what he has started to do, and he's been doing this now for a couple of years. In fact, he told me that as Dean of the Honors College, he's been doing this for a number of years, and he posts these little paragraphs on the bulletin board each day. And then he decided that he would put them online. The fact of the matter is, he does this daily, and his subscribers now total about 1,500. I mean, he has anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 hits a day on his emails. And what he does is he takes somebody's birthday from that particular day, and he does this each day, Saturdays and Sundays included. And he writes up a little paragraph or two about the person, the biography of the person, and why they're significant, and why it is significant to remember their birthday on this particular day. I've been on his mailing list now for close to a year. The other day, one day last week when we weren't on the air, this was his entry for the day. And it was so revealing to me because it focused exactly on what we've been talking about here at the Virtual Center, especially as it relates to Garry Wills's book, Inventing America, on the Declaration of Independence. So I'm just going to read what Bob wrote in this piece, and I think you'll get the idea. The vogue for Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1776, on the right, and generally among free market advocates, obscures the role that Smith's moral philosophy played in shaping the political economy of America's founding generation. To understand the point, first refer to Smith's other work, other being in quotations, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, written in 1759, and then to Smith's teacher, Francis Hutcheson, whose life task was to apply Lockean philosophy to issues of private and public ethics. Hutcheson was born in County Down, Ireland on August 8, 1694. So the day I received this email was last week on August 8th, which was Friday. Hutcheson was born in County Down, took his theology degree at Glasgow, and was ordained at the Church of Scotland in 1716. His association with New Light evangelicals caused him to leave the ministry, and a good marriage enabled him to devote the rest of his life to philosophy as, from 1729 on, the professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow. His writings dominated Scottish common sense philosophy and exercised great influence not only on Adam Smith, but partly as a required text in all the colonial colleges, on a whole generation of American political leaders, notably John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Wilson. His leading principles, including the moral sense and the public sense, held as a main value the determination to be pleased with the happiness of others and to be uneasy at their misery. I'm going to repeat that because it is in quotations. Hutcheson's leading principles, including the moral sense and the public sense, held as a main value, quote, the determination to be pleased with the happiness of others and to be uneasy at their misery, unquote. For Hutcheson and for his many disciples, the pursuit of happiness was a common as well as an individual imperative. It's good, too, that Hutcheson listed as another of his six senses a sense of the ridiculous. Every once in a while, it has been observed, one has to laugh if only to keep from crying. And I just thought that was a wonderful piece, but it was so appropriate last Friday that we would receive this after having spent the time that we spent on the Scottish Enlightenment and its impact on the Declaration of Independence. We talked quite a bit about Hutcheson's common sense philosophy. We talked about the idea of the moral sense. We talked about it as the basis of Jefferson's belief in equality. But I think a couple of comments that I wanted to make on this before I put this aside. Until I received this, it hadn't dawned on me that Bob, my friend Bob, whom I've known for 45 years, majored in colonial American history. And he taught American colonial history, American history generally, but specifically his focus area was colonial history in the mother country, in Great Britain, for 27 years. There's absolutely no question then that the Scottish Enlightenment that we've been focusing on in recent weeks, primarily by looking at the book by Garry Wills, is Bob's major. It's his strength. And I thought it was particularly significant that he made the point that Hutcheson's philosophy, his common sense philosophy, exercised great influence not only on Adam Smith, but as a required text in all the major colonial colleges, and on a whole generation of American political thinkers, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and James Wilson among them. Here's somebody who has specialized in this concentrated area of research, telling us, totally unsolicited, because I hadn't even thought about it, that the impact that these philosophers, Hutcheson, Adam Smith, David Hume, had on the founders and on the framers of the Constitution of the United States. I think it's particularly significant that Bob would say this, because this whole element of Scottish influence on our founders has effectively been deleted from our public education systems in this country. We have been pretty much exposed to a steady dose of John Locke's philosophy as it inspired Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. And we have been pretty much denied access to the thinking and the writings of Hutcheson and Hume and all the others, as they played a distinct role in Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence, and, as we'll see in the Federalist Papers, David Hume's incredible influence on James Madison as we move toward the drafting of the Constitution of the United States. The point I'm making is that the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment on Americans' political origins, on the establishment of the founding, on the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and the drafting of the Constitution of the United States, ought not to be a surprise. It ought not to be new stuff. It ought to be part of the overall effort to try to understand what these guys were all about and what motivated their thinking and their writing. But again, I think what we're becoming more and more aware of here at the Virtual Center as we go, week after week, month after month, is that increasingly I think we're beginning to come straight directly up against evidence to show that the way we interpret our past is pretty much driven by the political priorities of those who would control the present. Let me say that again, because I really mean it. I really think it's something that most of us have probably always known to a degree. But I think it's becoming more and more clear to me, at least, and I hope to you as well, the incredibly significant role that this has played in the interpretation of the past. The past, as we have learned it in our studies, in our schools, has been pretty much driven by the interpretations of choice by those whose political agenda seems to be driving the priorities of the nation at a particular point in time. We're going to see more of this. I'm putting together a couple of programs for next week, in which I think this will become increasingly even more clear than it is now. But in essence, because of the commitment to the idea of the market, the free market, free enterprise capitalism, the global economy, the tax policies associated with industrialism and investment and financial growth, all of these things have suggested a process whereby certain elements of our historical past become priorities, and other elements of our past have been allowed to slide toward the back burner, if not entirely off the table, forever. I think that's revealed by the fact that so few of us have been comfortable with the philosophies of these Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. And all you have to do is think back to what it is they're talking about. And Bob, my friend Bob, in this short email, makes the point about Hutcheson's common sense. If you remember, Garry Wills makes the point that when he talked about common sense philosophy, he was talking about community sense philosophy. And when he was talking about the moral sense and the public sense, Hutcheson was talking about the extent to which the emphasis on those issues related to the heart ought to take precedence, or at least carry equal weight to reason. But the view of the Enlightenment that we have been exposed to in the West has been that interpretation of the Enlightenment which focuses on John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and those people who put inordinate influence on reason to the exclusion of attention to sensibilities and sensitivities. And there tends to be much more of an emphasis on the self-interest and the betterment of the individual, and a coincident de-emphasis on the public good, on the interests of the community at large. And as you think back to some of the content we looked at related to Francis Hutcheson and David Hume and the rest of them, Adam Smith as well, we can recollect very easily, because it's not been that long ago, that these people's moral sense, emphasis on the moral sense, tended to put much greater emphasis on people's affections, on the sentiments, on the emotional aspects of the ingredients that created and strengthened society. as opposed to the issues of the individual. So consequently, the fact that the thinking and writing of these people was pretty much taken off the table for most of us growing up and going to school suggests very clearly that the way we look at the origins of the Declaration, the way we look at the framing of the Constitution, is to focus principally on the idea of liberty and to push the ideas of equality into the background by relegating them clearly to second-class, secondary status, to individual freedom and the ideas of liberty. And I think all we need to do is consider the priorities of those who are in a position and have the ability to influence those priorities in today's world to understand why and to understand the connection. So again, I'm very, first of all, I thoroughly enjoy these pieces that Bob sends out every morning, acknowledging the birthday of the day, so to speak, because I learn an awful lot from it. I mean, it's people, many of whom I've never heard of, and it's kind of enlightening for me, because every day is a new story. But this one was particularly significant, I felt, for us here at the Virtual Center. And the fact that it came from a man who has devoted his life to focusing on the writings and on the ideas of these people, I think it becomes very significant support for some of the issues and some of the things that we addressed and we looked at here at the Virtual Center. So again, I want to thank Bob, but for the piece. But I wanted to share that piece with you today. A third item, and I mentioned that at least the beginning of our program today looked like it was shaping up as a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I received an email from Betsy last Wednesday, August 6th, from Texas, and it sent me a link on an article that was related to teaching in a South Carolina school, and specifically it related to the fact that a third grade teacher in South Carolina was using Rush Limbaugh's book, Rush, Revere, and the Brave Pilgrims, in her history classes in South Carolina. And Betsy sent me the link because she wanted me to read about this. Obviously, she felt that it was a red flag as to the direction that some of our public schools are going. And I asked her if she minded if I shared this link here at the Virtual Center with our listeners. So if you'll bear with me, let me share this. It's on one page, so it's not that long. But I think it says an awful lot. It's a piece written by Caitlin McNeil, and here's the story. A third grade teacher in South Carolina called into Rush Limbaugh's radio show on Tuesday, which would have been August 5th last week, to thank him for his children's book, Rush, Revere, and the Brave Pilgrims, which she used to teach her students about slavery and the Civil War. Quote, Rush, thanks so much for writing these books. They're incredible. I'm telling you, I think that there need to be teachers' guides to go with these books. I think teachers need to have classroom sets of these books. The caller, whose name was Ivy, told Limbaugh during the show. The teacher explained that even though the third grade curriculum doesn't cover the Pilgrims, she was able to incorporate the author's note in Rush, Revere, and the Brave Pilgrims to introduce the Civil War. Quote, and then from there, I decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read a little bit of this book because I need these kids to get excited about it, she said. So I start reading the book, and as soon as they meet liberty, that was it. The giggles, the lights, you know, just absolutely they were thrilled with it, unquote. She then discovered Rush's second book, Rush, Revere, and the First Patriots, and was able to use it to teach her students about the Revolutionary War. Limbaugh was utterly delighted that students love his books and proceeded to read the author's note from the first book on American exceptionalism. Quote, and this is from the first book, Rush, Revere, and the Brave Pilgrims. This is Rush's statement on American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism and greatness means that America is special because it is different from all other countries in history. It is a land built on true freedom and individual liberty, and it defends both around the world, Limbaugh wrote. The sad reality is that since the beginning of time, most citizens of the world have not been free. For hundreds and thousands of years, many people in other civilizations and countries were servants to their kings, leaders, and government, unquote. The quotations go on. The United States of America is unique because it is the exception to all of this. Our country is the first country ever to be founded on the principle that all human beings are created as free people. The founders of this phenomenal country believed all people were born to be free as individuals. And so they established a government and leadership that recognized and established this for the first time ever in the world, Rush concluded. Ivy was then able to explain how she incorporated that into her lesson. I used that as a way to introduce the Civil War, you know, because we were about to enter a discussion on the time when slavery existed in our country. But because of what you said in that book and the way that you explained the founders' passion for our country, it was because of that that slavery inevitably was abolished, she said. So I felt like that would be a good way to get some conversation going. Limbaugh said this was brilliant. And then he said, it happens to be true. That's why it's brilliant. And they're old enough to understand that, he said. So again, the connection here between the philosophy of liberty, all people being created as free people, and slavery is that because our founders felt such passion for the country, that by itself caused the elimination or the abolition of slavery. And that is the lesson being taught to these third grade students in Ivory's class in South Carolina. I would ask that you just reflect for a moment on some of this, because I really think it's worth serious reflection. You'll remember some time ago here at the Virtual Center, we were exposed to a segment from a Christian-based radio program, and I can't remember the author, the host of the program, who was basically suggesting the idea that slavery in this country didn't end because of government, but it ended because people realized how inconsistent slavery was with the philosophy and the ideals of the founders. The fact of the matter is, there's no historical precedent for this. It doesn't take into consideration the activities of abolitionists. It doesn't take into consideration those who lost their lives in the fight to abolish slavery in this country.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
Can those of us who are past reflection just run screaming into the yard?
Isn't that something?
You think about these are third graders. How much of the third grade are they going to remember? Oddly enough, I remember a lot of the third grade. I just do. But are they going to look back and say, wow, Mrs. Schmendrick lied to us? When they find, how are they going to square that up with all the Confederate soldier statues all over South Carolina courthouse squares?
Right. And the Confederate cemeteries and the Union cemeteries and the number of people that died in this war. And Lincoln,
or that pile of bricks sitting out in Charleston Harbor.
Yes, called Fort Sumter. Yes, and the efforts of Abraham Lincoln and the assassination of Lincoln and on and on and on. And I'm thinking about civil rights people in the 20th century that were killed in churches that were burned. The church in Birmingham with the 4 little girls.
And the bombing and Medgar Evers
and the dogs and the fire hoses and I mean, how can you possibly ignore that? And the thing that bothers me is that the content of the book is what it is, and can take the author for what that's worth, but the fact of the matter is, theoretically, this teacher is certified to teach. And theoretically, this teacher ought to be able to see through some of this. And what bothers me more than anything is the fact that the teacher is more than willing, as long as it excites the kids and they giggle and all of this, then they're learning. And it doesn't matter what they're learning. And it's frightening to me.
It's terrifying. It is. It's the. Well, then again, I guess we live in a terrifying time, Dr. Bill. I mean, I saw some argument earlier today, and if Horst is listening, he saw it too, where some right-wing person said that, and I'm so tired of it. I'm just so bone tired of being told that the framers wanted limited government and liberty. I'm sorry, I'm doing the funny voices.
Yeah, I know.
Try not to, but if they wanted small government, they had that in the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, they certainly did, Bob.
The Constitution is a far more elaborate governmental scheme with much more broad-reaching powers.
One of the books that I've been reading, and this is just based on what you just said, Bob. I'm reading a book of essays written by Douglas Adair, who was a historian in the late 30s and 40s and in the 50s. He took his own life in 1968, which the general sense among the profession is that he became victim to the publish or perish thing. He had written all these wonderful essays, but he had not published a book. And so consequently, he was not considered a member of the group by other prominent historians around the country. And it really from what everything we read, it really bothered him that he never could quite secure the respect of his colleagues because he hadn't published a book. And anyway, when people went back after he took his own life and began to take seriously his essays, people began to realize that his essays were absolutely brilliant. And they were put together in a book. And I've been reading this book. But the point of my story is that it's just blowing my mind because most of it is about the founders, about the framing of the Constitution. But one of the things that he's struck by is the differences between Madison and Hamilton, as reflected in the Federalist Papers. And he wrote one of his most brilliant essays is an essay documenting once and for all, finally, who wrote which Federalist Papers. And for a long time through the 19th century, there was an effort to take a dozen of the disputed Federalist Papers written by Madison and assign them to Hamilton. And that effectively reduced Madison to secondary status in the authorship of the Federalist Papers. And more than anything else, it's the work of Douglas Adair in tracing the origins of every one of these papers that he's been able to document definitively that all of these disputed papers were written by Madison. But the interesting thing is, at the end of his life, and of course we know how Hamilton's life ended in in the early 19th century with the duel with Aaron Burr, that he points out that at the end of his life, Hamilton was rather blasé about the Federalist Papers. And it's very clear to Douglas Adair that Hamilton believed that he had moved on from what he had said in the Federalist Papers in 1787 and 88. He believed that the nation couldn't make it unless the government was strengthened even more than the Constitution did when it was ratified. And consequently, Hamilton in the 1790s and right up to the very end of his life believed that getting the Constitution ratified in 1788 had led him to say some things about government that weren't true, and that he felt like he had moved on, and he was much more informed and much more aware of what government needed at the end of the 19th century that he was in the middle of it. 17th century than he was in the middle of it. And 18th century, 1780s, 90s. And there's a quote in there from his papers, and I had never seen it before. Douglas Adair includes it. And Hamilton was setting about to revise many of his positions from the Federalist Papers. And his statement of explanation was, in the 1780s, during the ratification struggle, I gave the people milk. I'm now ready to give them meat. And it absolutely blew me to pieces, because what Hamilton is saying is as strong as his speech of June 18th in the Constitutional Convention was for a government modeled on England and the
Bill? Stand by, please.
Okay, Bob.
Ah, there you are. Okay. You said, and a government modeled on England.
That Hamilton's speech on June 18th, that we needed a government modeled on the British monarchy. He really believed that in order to get the Constitution ratified, we, meaning Federalists, had to compromise too much on the power of government. And he felt that it was necessary to take this to the next step. And so consequently, Hamilton's behavior as Secretary of the Treasury under Washington and his controversy with Jefferson within the Washington administration over the power of government and the idea of the judiciary and the the definitive idea of judicial review, and all of these things that were kind of equivocated that he didn't specify in the 80s. He was more than willing to lay claim to in the 1790s and beyond. But I thought the statement, in the 80s, I was forced to give the people milk. I'm now ready to give them meat.
Well, is he kind of saying that he was a little less than forthright?
Yes. He's saying that he was much less than forthright. And Douglas Adair's position is the reason that the controversy over who penned which Federalist Papers went on for so long was because Hamilton really never took the time to really document what he had done. Madison did, but Hamilton didn't. And the reason, according to Douglas Adair, is that Hamilton became rather blasé, because many of the ideas that were in papers that he had written as part of the Federalist Papers were ideas that he no longer subscribed to. And so consequently, he felt that he had moved on. And the essays that he was putting together during the controversy with the Jeffersonian Republicans in the 1790s, he felt was much more in tune with what this nation needed. And so consequently, when he was able to persuade Washington in 1793 to send federal troops into Pennsylvania in the so-called Whiskey Rebellion and to appoint him as the general in command of those troops, this was the Hamilton that he said was the real Hamilton. So this idea that you talk about, that the founders didn't want strong central government and wanted checks on the power of government and all of these other things, is so far removed from the evidence that it's not even funny. And it's because people don't know, Bob, that stories like this and books like Limbaugh's get serious attention from teachers. And it's frightening. It's frightening.
It is, and it's shocking. And just by way of sort of tying in, I noticed the front page story today in the Charleston Gazette was that this state is losing teachers at a higher and higher and faster rate. And it's not all a matter of baby boomers retiring.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of teachers crossing state lines to work in Virginia or Ohio or Pennsylvania, where they are considerably better paid.
Paid better, yes.
And I could not help thinking of you this morning over my morning cup of decaf when I read a statement or a quote in the paper saying that higher education is not turning out enough teachers. Well, anyone who has listened to this program and is familiar with your work with PRISM knows that, if anything, it is not a question of, you can't just have it be a question of quantity.
No.
There must be a question of quality. I don't know how old this woman was who contacted Rush Limbaugh, but I can tell you that it's almost a 100% lead pipe cinch sure bet that she's never read the Federalist Papers.
No.
I'm willing to bet she's never read the Constitution.
No.
I'm guessing she knows next to nothing about the Lincoln administration because she's and the sad thing is because she's a third grade teacher. Because that isn't, as she said, it's not on the test.
Yep. It doesn't matter.
Right. So we'll
it gets the kids excited. Whatever gets the kids excited, it doesn't matter whether it's in the curriculum or not. And we're talking about core standards for curriculum and the resistance that the core standards are getting, and you can begin to see why in this. Because there are, obviously we have teachers, and I'm not talking about any ones in particular, teachers in particular, but it's obvious from this story we have teachers who feel that they have license to go wherever they need to go and teach whatever they need to teach.
Whether it's even factual or not.
Well, exactly. It doesn't matter. And so what you do is you decide what you want the kids to believe, and any book that follows through on that is ripe for using in the classroom.
Can we have a little thought experiment here?
Sure, go ahead.
What would happen, do you suppose? Let's pretend that me, Bob Kincaid, let's pretend that I live in South Carolina for a moment and have a third grader in Mrs. Schmendrick's class. And my little third grader comes home all excited and giggling, telling me about how they were read to from this book by this patriot named Rush Revere. Now, I'm not going to have any of that. And I immediately go to the school, I go to the teacher, I go to the school board, and I say, you know, this is wholly inappropriate. This isn't history, this is indoctrination.
Mm-hmm.
How do you suppose that's going to play in a place like South Carolina? What would happen to this teacher if someone did call her on the carpet? She would become a persecuted person, wouldn't she?
Yes. Yes. But I'm guessing that she would receive a lot of support from colleagues, because my guess is that she's not an isolated person.
Oh, I tend to agree, and you know, I guess my final observation out of all of this would be that if the woman called Rush Limbaugh to talk about this, she was already gone down the rabbit hole.
That's right.
I mean, she wouldn't have owned this book.
No.
If she was not already an ideologue taking her ideology into the classroom.
Into the classroom.
The thing is, this stuff is so rich and fruitful for debate. You don't need to monkey with it, Bill.
No,
I mean,
no. All you have to do is read the sources and just deal with the facts as they are.
You know, you
don't have to.
You mentioned Francis Hutchinson a couple of minutes ago, and I'm gonna let you go and stop interrupting your train of thought.
You're doing fine.
But you made me think there for a minute. Remember anytime that we talk about teachers' salaries, or let's say an auto worker who's been on the assembly line for 20 years and makes a decent living or something like that, there's always a Republican, a right-winger, a libertarian, a John Birch or something like that out there who's saying, well, you know, why are they making that much money? They never say, as I suspect Francis Hutchinson would say, why isn't everybody making that much money?
Making that kind of money. Yeah, exactly.
And so once again we find out that these tenets of limited government and liberty and it's kind of a sham, isn't it?
Yeah.
Insofar as it's all just cover for cheap labor.
Yeah. Oh, Bob, you know that. You're right, and I'm looking at this piece of paper here, and the in quotes is this idea of American exceptionalism and Rush's definition of American exceptionalism, and you know, I mean, it is so dangerous and so wrong, and we're seeing it in the world today. The rest of the world is reacting against this stuff, and what we're doing is pulling the whole in after us. You know, it's amazing to me, but anyway, I thank Betsy for sending this to me. But Betsy teaches I believe she teaches in middle school.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And you begin to realize and appreciate the struggles that some of these teachers have, because she's going to get these kids. She's going to get kids who
philosophically
come from elementary
speaking,
schools. Right,
and South Carolina and Texas are not that far removed in terms of
and
the ideological control of the state.
These kids are going to look at her like she's crazy, because she's going to require them and ask them to think about things that they've always been told were true and never thought about at all.
Right, because they haven't been asked to critically think. They've been asked to accept and regurgitate.
You know, the idea that slavery ended because of the founders' passions for the country. And therefore, in other words, they realized the inconsistencies, so therefore slavery just disappeared. What about the war? You know,
when did it disappear, Dr. Bill? I mean, it sounds like it disappeared on July the 4th, 1776, or at best 1781, or maybe 1787.
And I'm thinking of Jefferson being forced to take out what he thought was the most important section of the Declaration.
So
on slavery. In order to get it passed.
Right. Who were all those people working in the cotton fields? Independent contractors?
God almighty.
I'm sorry. No, see, like I said, I started out, running screaming into the yard. One last thing, and I'm going to quit on this business of teachers and the paucity of teachers and needing more teachers. Do you ever notice, and I'm sure that West Virginia is not the only state. In fact, I know it's not the only state. States send out these economic development junkets, Dr. Bill, and most frequently they go to Japan or they go to China. When's the last time you read a story of a state sending an economic development junket to Finland?
Yeah.
Finland has the single most successful teacher training program on planet Earth.
That's right, they do.
Why haven't we sent the head of the state board of education and the head of the 2 West Virginia teachers unions? Why haven't we put them on a plane and sent them to Helsinki? Our listener in Sweden, Bob, and Scott, yes,
Scott, yeah. I'd love to be able to talk to him a little bit about.
Oh, we've got a listener in Finland too.
Well, Scandinavia. I mean, the Scandinavian countries seem to be having so much more success in their schools than we are. Finland is the one that everybody talks about, but I know that Sweden as well is up there, and I just like to hear from somebody who's there what some of the differences are.
Well, for starters, it's a matter of valuing the teacher.
Yeah, I know that, and I mean they want their best people in the classroom, not mediocre people.
Right,
the best people.
The Scandinavians don't have nearly as many shortstops to pay $50 million a year to.
No. Now you're into something totally different. You get into this business with the NCAA and all this, Bob. But anyway, you're right. I mean, but you're right. These junkets don't go there. They go to places.
And that's my larger question. Why is it that the only definition that we can give to economic development is bring your factory here? Why is teaching not economic development?
The development of young minds, it would be economic development.
Sure. And if you build a truly top-notch public school system, is that not going to entice factories to locate in your state?
Right.
I mean, we're assuming a corporation that actually cares about its employees, of course, but.
And that's the kind of thing that happens with with college towns and everything else, that people go to these areas because it's where they want to raise their children, it's where they want to live, it's where they want to retire. And yet when we send our people on these junkets, they go to education systems that we help form, rather than those systems that develop in directions which are opposite in some cases to the education system we have.
Exactly, and I have burned up a quarter hour of your program, and I apologize.
You are,
Dr. Bill.
Bob. You are fine. In fact, we might as well take a break right now because we're at 59 minutes after the hour.
Thank you, Dr. Bill.
Let's take 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you, Bob. We'll take 4 or 5 minute break, and then we'll come back with our second hour. What I'd like to do in our second hour is deal a little bit with, and this is totally on a different plane. Deal a little bit with the very famous Annapolis Convention of 1786, which was precipitated, if you will, the Constitutional Convention of May 1787. Part of it is the result of work done by Garry Wills, but I wanted to share with you some thinking about the Annapolis Convention. We'll do that when we come back. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have reached the top of our first hour. It is 2 p.m. in the East. We'll pause for a 5-minute break. We'll be right back with our second hour. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and we just had a 15-minute conversation, Bob Kincaid and I, that I thoroughly enjoyed. It was based, for those of you who were with us in the last 15 minutes of our first hour, it was based on a teacher in South Carolina who was using one of Rush Limbaugh's books in a third grade class. and we were looking at some of the content of that book and Rush's definition of American exceptionalism and what makes America great, and we were talking about the implications of that for our educational system. It takes what we're doing and makes it all so meaningful and so real, and I appreciate Bob's willingness to pop in and share his thinking and his ideas on this issue with us all. It is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. If you are just joining us for today's program, I want to welcome you to the Virtual Center, and I want to thank you for your willingness to devote some of your valuable time. There are, from all sorts, all different venues today, we hear more and more that the most valuable thing that people seem to have in today's world is time. And if you are tuning in on a regular basis to the Virtual Center and you are willing to give us a portion of your time, then I want you to know how first of all, how appreciative I am of that. But secondly, I want you to know how seriously I take that willingness on your part to commit time to this program. I'll do the very best that I can do, and I know the folks here at Head On, Bob Kincaid and his folks at Head On, will do the same thing as well. So, again, thank you so very, very much for tuning in. If you've been with us since the top of our program today, 1 hour ago, then I thank you for staying with us. That says something very, very special, and I take that seriously as well. Our phone number, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate individually with me one-on-one on some of these issues, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Just prior to the top of our hour, before we took break, I mentioned the Annapolis Convention of September 1786. We've talked about the Annapolis Convention here at the Virtual Center on 3 or 4 different occasions during the months that we've been getting together during the weeks, and we haven't really looked at the Annapolis Convention in any detail at all. And it seems to me that it's worth looking at for a number of reasons. Traditionally, most people have looked upon the Annapolis Convention as a way station on the road to the Constitutional Convention. You can go all the way back into the 1780s, as early as 1783, 4 years before the Constitutional Convention of May 1787. And in the Virginia legislature, James Madison introduced legislation in 1783 for a major reform or revision of the Articles of Confederation. Because already Madison and some of the other so-called nationalists throughout the various states were beginning to realize that there were serious flaws to the structure of government as created by the Articles of Confederation, and that substantial reform was going to be necessary, they believed, if America was going to successfully navigate the world of free nations after independence. We talked about the structure of the Articles of Confederation before. The fact that it was not a government over the states. It was a confederation, a league of friendship among equal states. It was an organization created by independent states, committing to the fact that they would cooperate in those areas where they believed it was necessary to cooperate in order to win the war for independence. But it was not a government over the states. It was a league of friendship among states. Power was in the legislative branch. There was no executive branch as such. There was a council of revision within Congress, representatives that would meet on an interim basis when Congress was not in session. But there was no executive branch per se, nor was there an independent judiciary. For all practical purposes, government as an entity was concentrated in the legislative branch. And Congress was rendered totally dependent on the states for revenue and for military operations. Congress was denied the power to raise an army. The only thing that Congress could do was to request troops from the states. Congress was also denied the power to tax, which meant that Congress could only secure revenue by asking the states for it. Congress was also denied the power to regulate commerce, thereby denying Congress the revenue from tariffs, from commercial tariffs that were the direct product of trade or commercial activity. Madison introduced legislation in the Virginia legislature as early as 1783 to reform the Articles of Confederation. It didn't really, at that point, stand too much chances of passage. But traditionally, historians have looked at this as the beginning of the process of change, of reform, that culminated in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Most textbooks who deal with the road to Philadelphia, so-called, will usually focus on a conference that met at Mount Vernon, at George Washington's residence at Mount Vernon in March of 1785. This was a conference of representatives from Maryland and Virginia who had called the meeting so that the states could negotiate matters of commerce between the two states. The two states were contiguous. As you know, they were separated by the Potomac River. And so matters like controlling commerce on the Potomac River, deciding which state would get revenue and tariffs, taxes, from commercial activity, trade and commerce on the Chesapeake Bay, for example. These kinds of real commercial issues seemed to be worthy of the two states getting together, sitting down, and working out these commercial matters. When the convention, it was called to meet at Alexandria, Virginia, but when the delegates got together, they moved to Mount Vernon. Washington invited them to Mount Vernon. I facetiously used to say in my history classes all the time that, you know, that chances are Martha promised them brown beans and cornbread or something. But anyway, they adjourned to reconvene at Mount Vernon. And while the results of the Mount Vernon conference were not very meaningful, what did come out of the Mount Vernon meeting was the recognition that other states had commercial issues related to interstate trade as well. And the thinking was that perhaps all states would benefit from sending delegates to a commercial convention to talk about interstate trade, commerce, and tariffs. And that conference met at Annapolis, Maryland, in September of 1786. And as we've talked about previously here at the Virtual Center, when the Annapolis Convention convened, only 5 states were represented. There were only 12 delegates that showed up. And a couple of those delegates were not really empowered as official delegates at all. For example, Madison was there. Madison was actually there a week before the conference started. But he was not appointed by the governor or by the legislature as an official representative of Virginia. But he was there anyway, as was Alexander Hamilton, who was not empowered to speak for his state, New York, either. And while the Annapolis Convention has been treated by historians as rather insignificant because so few states showed up, Hamilton was successful in snatching victory from defeat by issuing a call for yet another Congress to meet the following May in Philadelphia. But unlike the Annapolis Convention or the Mount Vernon Conference, this one was for the express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And no sooner did the Annapolis Convention end in September of 1786 than rebellion broke out in western Massachusetts, known in the history books as Shays' Rebellion, after one of the leaders of the rebellion, Daniel Shays, who was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And as a result of open rebellion in western Massachusetts, many states became convinced, that may not have been convinced before, that reform of the Articles was necessary. So consequently, where only 5 states were represented at Annapolis, 12 states showed up at Philadelphia. The only state not represented at the Philadelphia Convention was Rhode Island. And we know that the Constitution of the United States came out of the Philadelphia Convention in September of 1787. And that Constitution was then distributed by Congress to the states with a recommendation for ratification. That is the traditional story that appears in most of our history books about the Annapolis Convention. The Annapolis Convention is looked upon as one stage in a process of reforming the Articles of Confederation, which began early in the 1780s and didn't reach conclusion until the summer of 1787. Garry Wills, in his book Explaining America on the Federalist Papers, chooses Annapolis as the first chapter in his book. And in this chapter, Wills introduces a somewhat different approach to the Annapolis Convention, which I think is worthy of attention. Principally because it raises serious questions about the role of both Hamilton and Madison in the movement towards the Constitution of the United States. Let me be specific. James Madison did not support the Annapolis Convention. He was there because he felt like he could provide an influence there. But he did not support the Annapolis Convention. Neither had Madison attended the Mount Vernon Conference in March of 1785. And this is particularly, I think, kind of interesting. The reason that Madison did not attend the Mount Vernon Conference in March of 85 is because he was not given the information on it by the governor, Patrick Henry. Clearly, Patrick Henry intentionally made sure that James Madison was not at Mount Vernon. Neither was Edmund Randolph. Patrick Henry was the person as governor whose responsibility it was to nominate Virginia's representatives at Mount Vernon. He did not share the dates or the place with either Madison or Randolph. Therefore, Madison was not the person who called for the Annapolis Convention in the fall of 1786. In fact, the call for Annapolis was made by John Tyler, who's the father of President Tyler. If you remember Tippecanoe and Tyler too, this was his father, John Tyler. And he is the one that issued the call for the Annapolis Convention, principally because Tyler represented commercial interests in the Tidewater, especially commercial interests in and around Alexandria. In other words, Tyler's interest was principally in commercial reform. This is, I think, a very, very interesting spin on this particular conference. The Annapolis Convention was called for purposes of commercial reform. But all of our history books have consistently told us that the issue was not commerce at all, that commerce was merely a ruse to get the delegates together when the real agenda item was revision of the Articles of Confederation. The fact of the matter is, and Garry Wills points this out, the evidence does not support that thesis. Because Madison had made the proposal in Virginia in 1783 to revise the Articles of Confederation. But Madison was not at Mount Vernon. Therefore, Madison was not involved in the calling of the Annapolis Convention. He was not a representative at the Annapolis Convention. He attended, but his letters indicate that he did not support the Annapolis Convention. And this is the contribution that Garry Wills makes, which I think is a very, very significant one. Why would Madison be opposed to the Annapolis Convention? The answer? Because Madison recognized that if the Annapolis Convention were successful, if commercial reform, real reform, did come out of the Annapolis Convention, then the chances were pretty remote that you would ever get a follow-up conference to revise the Articles of Confederation. Madison's whole agenda was based on revision of the Articles. Madison was opposed to anything that would diminish the prospects for a constitutional convention designed to revise the Articles of Confederation. Madison is very consistent with this. We read here at the Virtual Center a few weeks ago, Federalist number 49, in which Madison took issue with Thomas Jefferson over the idea of conventions, revisionary conventions. Madison believed that they were counterproductive because chances are they wouldn't be successful. And even if they were successful, the mere fact that they were successful would diminish the opportunity to get the real issues on the table at a much more meaningful convention. So Madison, in Federalist number 49, was very much opposed to the idea of a revisionary convention. Consequently, it's perfectly consistent with Madison's position that he would oppose the Annapolis Convention. And in Garry Wills's book, and I'm just sharing with you a couple of what I think are relevant comments, Garry Wills says, as a member for Virginia at the Confederate Congress of 1783, Madison had joined the opposition to partial conventions of states trying to settle their own commercial and boundary disputes. Madison was afraid that if any of these commercial conventions were successful, it would derail the opportunity for getting a real constitutional convention. Just before the Annapolis Convention in September of 1786, Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson and said the following: "Many gentlemen, both within and without Congress, wish to make this meeting subservient to a plenipotentiary convention for amending the Confederation." So what Madison is saying is many people outside Congress, many people in Congress see the idea of a commercial convention as leading to a further convention to amend the Articles. Though my wishes are in favor of such an event, yet I despair so much of its accomplishment at the present crisis that I do not extend my views beyond a commercial reform. To speak the truth, I almost despair even of this. What Madison is suggesting is the commercial convention, Annapolis, is dangerous because of the fact that it might work. And if there is commercial reform actually implemented, then the chances of ever getting a constitutional convention are almost nil. Madison is very, very consistent with that. Consequently, Madison does not support the calling of the Annapolis Convention. But the intrigue about movement to reform the Articles of Confederation that was existent all through the country at this time was rampant. People in the states did not trust each other. The reason that only 12 states showed up at Annapolis, in part, is because some states didn't want to have anything to do with it because they knew that there were those at the convention who would be moving for something more. And Madison would have been one of these. Rufus King, Congress representative from Massachusetts, in June of 1786, 3 months before the Annapolis Convention met, also was opposed to the Annapolis meeting. But his major concern was distrust of Madison and distrust of Virginia, distrust of the entire South. This particular letter from Rufus King in 1786, I think, says an awful lot about the distrust among states and regions prior to the Annapolis Convention. In many ways, it makes the Constitutional Convention and the success of the Constitutional Convention even more surprising than we would anticipate. Rufus King says, "It is doubtful what the real sentiments of Virginia are on the question of commercial powers. This is certain, that the proposition for the Annapolis Convention, which originated in the Assembly of Virginia, did not come from the persons favorable to a commercial system common to all states, but from those who in opposition to such a general system have advocated the particular regulations of individual states." What Rufus King is pointing out here is the people in Virginia who made the proposal for the Annapolis Convention are not the same people that are in favor of commercial reform. Obviously, Massachusetts is, because Massachusetts is a commercial state. Rufus King goes on, "The merchants through all the states are of one mind and in favor of a national system. The planters of the southern states are divided in their opinions, and it is to be feared that the majority is against the only plan which can ensure the prosperity and honor of the Confederacy. So New England is suspicious of the motives of the Southerners, of Virginians." James Monroe, who sits in Congress, writes a letter to Madison during this period, and Monroe speaks to what he sees as a conspiracy to extrude the South from the Confederation. I can't resist the temptation to go back to our first hour today and talk about the third grade teacher who is teaching history out of Rush Limbaugh's Rush Revere and the Pilgrim's book. Because all of this interstate distrust finds no place in the American exceptionalism argued by Rush Limbaugh and those of his ilk. Here's Monroe writing to Madison and suggesting a conspiracy on the part of northern commercial states to cut out the South. And Monroe says the following: "It is manifest here in Congress that John Jay, New York, and his party in Congress are determined to pursue this business, negotiations with Spain, for rights to the Mississippi, access to the Mississippi River, as far as possible, either as the means of throwing the Western people and territory without the government of the United States and keeping the weight of population and government here in New York, or of dismembering the government itself for the purpose of a separate confederacy. Monroe is suggesting that the purpose of the Annapolis Convention is a commercial conspiracy by John Jay and New York commercial interests, probably in conjunction with New England commercial interests, to use a convention like Annapolis to surrender the Mississippi, navigation of the Mississippi, which would hurt the South, but would keep all of the commerce from the western interior parts of the continent flowing east through New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, rather than south to New Orleans. In other words, Monroe and other Virginians believed that New England was looking to sell out the South, and that's what this Annapolis call was all about. Garry Wills points out that when Shays' rebellion occurred, right after the Annapolis Convention ended, Henry Lee of Virginia saw Shays' rebellion as part of a Northern conspiracy. And this is what Henry Lee sees Shays' rebellion as being about. The insurgents, Daniel Shays, the insurgents are taking all the necessary arrangements to prepare for the last appeal. Their ostensible object is the revision of the Constitution, but they certainly mean the abolition of debts, public and private, a division of property, and new government founded on principles of fraud and inequity, or reconnection with Great Britain. Henry Lee believes that Shays' rebellion is part of a Northern conspiracy on the part of Northern commercial interests to possibly reconnect a portion of America with Great Britain, the commercial portion, by dividing the nation into smaller units or confederacies. And then the commercial interests of the North and Middle states could link up with the British, and the South could fend for itself. And part of that was seen as the conspiracy to sell out the South by engaging in negotiations with Spain to close commerce on the Mississippi River, which would kill the development of the South and would continue to see the flow of commerce into the northern and eastern states. This kind of distrust, state against state, region against region, is really the background for the Annapolis Convention. This is the kind of stuff that Madison spoke about in The Vices of the Political System. This was the intrigue and unwillingness of states and regions to cooperate. The only thing that got the states to cooperate during the Confederation in the early period was the war against England. But once the war ended, once the reason for cooperation among states was gone, then there was serious question among Madison, Hamilton, and the other nationalists whether there was even a chance that the Union could be preserved. This is part of the background to the Constitutional Convention and the Annapolis Convention. So Madison, for example, is opposed to Annapolis, not so much because he's opposed to commercial reform. He's afraid that commercial reform will take the steam out of the movement to revise the Articles, and that, he believes, and Hamilton believes, is really what this has to be all about. Only 5 states showed up in Annapolis. 12 delegates, 12 representatives from the 5 states. Only 3 states were officially represented. John Dickinson came there from Delaware. William Churchill Houston came from New Jersey. He was a representative that had taught Madison at Nassau Hall, which is now Princeton University. And of course, Wills points out that while there weren't many people at the Annapolis Convention, when the Constitutional Convention meets in May of 1787, 9 members of the 55 delegates who show up at Philadelphia are graduates of Princeton. Only 3 from Harvard, 4 from Yale, 9 from Princeton. What does that tell us about the influence of Witherspoon, the president, the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment on the delegates to the Constitutional Convention? When one of the representatives of Annapolis is a professor at Princeton. Maryland, and I mentioned this before, Maryland is not represented at Annapolis, even though the convention meets in the Maryland State House at Annapolis. Wills's position is that the reason Maryland boycotts the Annapolis Convention is because Maryland also fears that if the convention is successful, then the move to revise the Articles of Confederation will be unsuccessful. So therefore, Maryland boycotts the Annapolis Convention. When the group gets together, the turnout is so poor that it looks like all is lost. However, and this is content, credit Garry Wills for pulling this together. One of the representatives from New Jersey, Abraham Clark, brought with him a commission from the state of New Jersey that went beyond commerce and gave the delegates permission to negotiate issues other than commerce. Madison and Hamilton see opportunity in this commission brought to Annapolis by Abraham Clark. This is what Garry Wills says. Since the convention was itself so powerless, the commission carried by Abraham Clark from the state legislature of New Jersey came as close as anything to an official call for more serious measures. The Annapolis Convention, by a maneuver attributed to Madison and Hamilton, used Clark's credentials as its main piece of business, passing on New Jersey's call in the formal address to Congress. Hamilton writes the formal address of the Annapolis Convention to Congress based on the instructions brought to the Congress, to the Annapolis Convention, by Abraham Clark of New Jersey. Hamilton moves in and seizes the moment. Consequently, the official Annapolis report to Congress urges the delegates, quote, to consider how far a uniform system in their commercial regulations and other important matters might be necessary to the common interest and permanent harmony of the several states, effectually to provide for the exigencies of the Union. This is taken directly from the instructions given to Abraham Clark by the legislature of New Jersey when he reports to the Annapolis Convention. Hamilton takes that New Jersey commission, takes the language directly, and adopts it as the official report of the Annapolis Convention. Let me read it again. The report drafted by Hamilton takes from Clark's commission the statement urging the delegates, quote, to consider how far a uniform system in their commercial regulations and other important matters, in italics, might be necessary to the common interest and permanent harmony of the several states, effectually to provide for the exigencies of the Union. And Garry Wills points out that the italics where for other important matters is in the original report, the Annapolis report. Hamilton goes on with the official report of the Annapolis Convention. In this persuasion, your commissioners submit an opinion that the idea of extending the powers of their deputies to other objects than those of commerce, which has been adopted by the state of New Jersey, was an improvement on the original plan and will deserve to be incorporated into that of a future convention. In other words, Hamilton borrows the language of the New Jersey Commission to Abraham Clark and makes it the official report to Congress of the Annapolis Convention. This becomes the official document. And then Hamilton closes the report by going back to Abraham Clark's commission and saying the following: to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. Consequently, the Annapolis Convention became the vehicle for calling the Constitutional Convention of May 1787. What is there in this story that all of us need to take from these quotes and this detail? What's the message here? The message is that almost from the very beginning, even while the war was still going on, Madison and Hamilton and other nationalists began to recognize the need to strengthen the central government, thereby taking power away from the separate states. The Articles of Confederation, in which the sovereign states are sovereign, are all-powerful, they believe cannot work in the long run and must be revised. The problem is that the only chance to get the nation strengthened, to strengthen the Articles of Confederation by revising it, which required revising it meant you had to have unanimous consent of all the states. Rhode Island is not even there. But during the last part of the war in 1781, 1782, Hamilton and other nationalists realized that the pressures of the war probably hold the best chance for strengthening the central government by revising the Articles of Confederation. once peace comes, once the peace treaty is signed, gaining independence for the 13 former colonies, chances of revising the Articles become minimal. Consequently, Hamilton, Tench, Cox, and other nationalists participate in what historians refer to as the Newburgh Conspiracy, which is a rebellion within the Continental Army, within Washington's army, with the threat that the troops would refuse to put down their weapons and would even march on Congress and take Congress prisoner until Congress was willing to strengthen the Articles at least enough to acquire the revenue necessary to pay them what was owed them as members of the Continental Army. There's no question that the Newburgh Conspiracy, rebellion within the Continental Army, was instigated by these nationalists in their efforts to strengthen the central government. It's an indication of how desperate they really believed this government had to be strengthened. The Newburgh Conspiracy is not successful, but primarily because General Washington finds out about it and makes an impassioned plea to the officers. In a speech to the officers, he effectively pulls the plug on the Newburgh Conspiracy. The peace treaty is signed in 1783, and the nationalists realize that their efforts to strengthen the central government will have to wait till another day. It's at that point that Madison introduces legislation in Virginia to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Then in 85 comes the Mount Vernon Conference. In September of 86 comes Annapolis, and then the Constitutional Convention itself in May of 1787. I think what we need to take from this content, from these historical pieces of evidence, is the extent to which the nationalists, the Hamiltons and the Madisons and the Washingtons and the John Jays and the rest of them, those that are later going to become Federalists with the adoption of the Constitution of the United States, recognize that you've got to have a strong central government in order for the Republic to work. And they are willing to take desperate steps in order to implement that kind of political reform. But again, it is not accurate to suggest that there was a consistent series of steps through the 1780s leading to the Constitutional Convention. Rather, whereas the history books have traditionally looked upon Mount Vernon and Annapolis as efforts to use commerce as a vehicle to bring delegates together in order to reform the Articles of Confederation, Madison and Hamilton and the others realize that a commercial convention would be very dangerous, because what if it succeeded? Then the ultimate goal would never be realized. So Madison becomes an opponent of Annapolis. But it's only through the efforts of Hamilton to seize upon the instructions New Jersey legislators gave to Abraham Clark and appropriate those instructions as the official document of the Annapolis Convention sent to Congress, that what appears to be total defeat at Annapolis turns out to be the vehicle whereby the Constitutional Convention is called in 1787. I think it indicates how desperate the situation is under the Articles of Confederation. James Madison, in his Vices of the Political System, laid out the details as to what was wrong with the Articles and why they didn't work. I think the history of this period follows through on that concern expressed by Madison, by Hamilton, and by the others in a series of different venues. So I think all of this is very, very important for us to know. It speaks specifically to the need to go back to the sources. You get into trouble when you begin to read the priorities of contemporary interests back into the past, because you tend to make assumptions that aren't true. What historians do and must do is look at the evidence and let the interpretation flow from the evidence, rather than cherry-picking the evidence to support an interpretation which already exists. Again, I've said this many times. I can't overemphasize it enough. There's a difference between allowing the evidence to dictate the conclusions, which is valid, honest historical research, the pursuit of truth, as it were, and the alternative, which is the exact opposite of honest research, which is cherry-picking the past by selecting the evidence that best supports the conclusion you want the evidence to support. In other words, you already have your conclusion. Now you're going in and trying to find evidence to back it up. In the latter case, what you are doing is allowing the political priorities of the present to dictate the historical realities of the past. You cannot do that. But it's done all the time. And I think the letter from the conversation with Rush Limbaugh by the third grade teacher from South Carolina, and Rush Limbaugh's definition of American exceptionalism is an indication as to how this whole thing can derail if not caught and halted early. There's no question that this definition of American exceptionalism, which is the belief system being perpetrated on our young people, is the system that the Limbaughs of the world want the evidence to support. Consequently, the only way they can do that is to write their own history. Thus we have Rush Revere and the Pilgrims, and Rush Revere and the Patriots. Tailor-made history for today's young people, which gives them the conclusion that these people want to leave. It has nothing to do with historical evidence. This teacher admitted that she felt very comfortable using material on the Civil War to teach the founding, and using material on the founding to teach the Civil War, and moving around. The evidence is nothing. It's merely there for your convenience in order to make the point and illustrate the points you want to make. Very dangerous. Very dangerous. It is 59 minutes after the hour. We have completed our program today, so we're going to get out of the way and let 3 o'clock programming take over at the Head On Radio Network. I'm Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you for listening. Be safe.